Sir, step away from the mailboxes, please.
Good morning, officers. I am U.S. Postal Inspector Vincent Marshall.
You are a what?
Postal Inspector. I am investigating the mail theft complaints in this neighborhood.
Where's your uniform, your postal vehicle?
Postal inspectors are federal criminal investigators. We work in...
The morning was quiet until it wasn't. "What are you doing with those mailboxes?" The officer set his hand already resting on his belt. "I'm working," the man replied calmly. "Federal mail inspection. Step away from the boxes now. Hands where I can see them." It was 8:12 a.m. in a small suburban neighborhood where nothing ever happened. The air still carried the damp smell of grass from overnight sprinklers. A delivery truck idled 2 houses down. Somewhere a garage door hummed open. In the center of it all stood a black man in a dark windbreaker, latex gloves still on his hands, a clipboard tucked under his arm next to a cluster of community mailboxes with their doors open. "I said step away," the officer repeated, voice sharper now. "Sir, I'm a postal inspector. I'm authorized to be here." The officer took a step closer. The radio on his shoulder crackled with static. His eyes flicked to the open mail slots, then back to the man's face. "You're stealing mail." "We got a call." The man exhaled slowly. He reached for his jacket pocket, careful, deliberate. "I have credentials. I can show you. Don't reach for anything. Turn around." The distance between misunderstanding and confrontation collapsed in seconds. A neighbor stood frozen on a driveway, phone half raised. Curtains shifted in nearby windows. The officer's posture stiffened, shoulders squared, authority fully engaged. The man's hands stopped midair, hovering palms open exactly where he'd been trained to keep them. "Sir, listen to me," the man said. His voice stayed even, but his jaw tightened. "I investigate mail theft. I'm assigned to this route today." The officer shook his head. "That's not what I see. What I see is a guy digging through mailboxes." Metal clicked as the officer pulled his handcuffs free. The sound cut through the morning like a warning bell. The man's eyes dropped to the cuffs, then lifted again, steady but alert. "This is a mistake," he said. "A serious one. You can explain it downtown." A light breeze rattled the loose mailbox doors. Somewhere a dog barked once, then stopped. The officer moved behind the man, close enough that the smell of coffee and aftershave mixed with the faint scent of paper and ink from the mail. Cold steel touched skin. The man closed his eyes for half a second as the cuffs tightened around his wrists, not in fear. In calculation. He knew the law. He knew what this meant. And he knew that every second from this moment on was evidence. As the patrol car door opened, a phone camera zoomed in from across the street. No one said a word, but everyone understood that something had gone very wrong. He had learned early that paper could ruin lives. Long before that morning on the quiet street, before the mailboxes and the handcuffs, he had grown up watching envelopes decide who ate and who didn't. Past due notices, court letters, government seals that made his mother go silent before opening them. He was raised on the understanding that mail was not just paper. It was power. And when that power was abused, people like his family paid the price. That belief carried him through college, through a criminal justice degree earned at night while working days through a federal background investigation that dug into every friend he had ever known. When he was accepted into the United States Postal Inspection Service, it wasn't a job to him. It was a mission. He trained in fraud detection, narcotics interdiction, identity theft. He learned how criminal networks used stolen mail to wipe out bank accounts, how a single intercepted check could destroy a small business. By his 15th year as a postal inspector, he had testified in dozens of federal cases. He had helped dismantle mail theft rings operating across 3 states. He had pulled fentanyl shipments out of parcels before they reached streets. His supervisors described him as meticulous, calm under pressure, by the book. He wore plain clothes by design. He blended in because he had to. The best inspectors were invisible. That morning, he'd been assigned to a cluster box unit that had triggered multiple complaints. Missing checks, opened envelopes, elderly residents reporting accounts drained days after expected deliveries. He logged the time, put on gloves, opened the compartments legally with a master key issued to him alone. Every step documented, every action defensible. And then there was the officer. He had joined the department 8 years earlier. A local guy, high school football, military reserve, solid test scores. No early red flags, at least none that stuck. His evaluations used the same phrases year after year. Proactive, assertive, needs improvement with de-escalation. He had collected complaints the way some officers did. Not enough to end a career, enough to form a pattern if someone ever bothered to look closely. Most of those complaints sounded familiar. Stops that escalated. Assumptions made too quickly. People who didn't fit his internal picture of who belonged where. Each time he'd been cleared. No body camera footage, no cooperative witnesses, no discipline beyond a conversation and a signature. On that morning, his shift had started badly. A domestic call that turned out to be nothing. A supervisor writing him about response times. Then a radio call came in. Suspicious person, possible mail theft. Male black digging through mailboxes. That was all he heard. When he turned onto the street and saw a black man standing at open mailboxes, the story wrote itself in his head. He didn't consider the gloves, the clipboard, the methodical way the compartments were being checked. He didn't ask what crime had actually been reported. He saw an opportunity to take control of a situation before it got out of hand. That instinct had served him before. Act first, question later. When the man spoke, calmly used correct terminology, offered credentials, it didn't register as professionalism. It registered as defiance. The officer had been challenged before, and every time he backed down, it stuck with him. This time he wasn't going to look uncertain. Not in front of witnesses. Not after making the call in his head. As the cuffs closed, both men understood something, but in very different ways. The inspector understood that his career, his reputation, and his freedom were being temporarily placed in the hands of someone who did not recognize his authority. He began mentally cataloging details, time statements, witness positions. He had built cases from less. The officer understood only that he had committed. And once he committed, retreat felt impossible. 2 lives, 2 histories. One built on patient documentation and the quiet weight of federal law. The other shaped by unchecked assumptions and a system that rarely forced him to slow down. They collided not because of chance, but because no one had ever made the officer stop before. The street felt smaller now. The patrol car sat at an angle by the curb, engine idling, lights off, but present a quiet threat. The inspector stood cuffed beside it, shoulders straight, eyes forward. The gloves were still on his hands now, useless, wrinkled against the steel. The clipboard lay on the ground near the mailboxes, papers fluttering slightly in the breeze. "I need you to listen to me," the inspector said. His voice carried just far enough for the nearest houses to hear. "I am a federal postal inspector. I am assigned to this location. You can verify that with one call." The officer didn't answer. He adjusted his grip on the man's arm and guided him toward the back seat. "You can tell it to the sergeant," he said. A woman across the street finally raised her phone all the way. She wasn't shouting. She wasn't interfering. She was recording. Another neighbor stepped out onto a porch, squinting into the morning light. "What's going on?" Someone asked. Not to anyone in particular. "He's stealing mail." The officer said louder now, as if volume could turn accusation into fact. "That's not true," the inspector replied. His head turned slightly toward the onlookers. "I work for the Postal Inspection Service. I have identification on me." The officer's jaw tightened. He didn't look at the neighbors. He didn't look at the mailboxes anymore. He was locked into the moment he'd created. "Sir, stop talking." The inspector stopped. Not because he had nothing to say, but because he understood escalation. Silence could be safer than the wrong word. Still his eyes moved, noting who was filming, who was watching, where they stood. Evidence didn't just exist on paper. It existed in people. A man in jogging clothes slowed to a walk, earbuds dangling. "This doesn't look great," he muttered. "Not quietly enough." The officer shot him a look that ended the comment. Authority reclaimed the space. The back door of the patrol car opened. The inspector hesitated for half a second. He looked back at the open mailboxes, at the envelopes half returned to their slots, at the work left unfinished. Then he ducked his head and sat down. The door closed with a dull final sound. Inside the car, the smell of vinyl and disinfectant filled his nose. The seat was hard. His wrists ached slightly where the cuffs pressed. He stared straight ahead, breathing slow, forcing his pulse down. He replayed the exchange word for word. He knew exactly where the violation had occurred. He knew there would be more. Outside, the officer leaned against the car for a moment, radio pressed to his shoulder. He gave a brief report, clipped and confident. Suspect detained, possible mail theft, investigation ongoing. What he didn't say was that he hadn't checked credentials, that he hadn't articulated a crime, that witnesses were watching, recording, forming their own conclusions. As the car pulled away, the neighbors stood in silence, phone still raised. No one cheered. No one clapped. The street returned to its quiet, but it was a different quiet now. The kind that lingers after something wrong has happened in plain view. In the back seat, the inspector closed his eyes briefly, then opened them. He wasn't thinking about getting out of the cuffs. He was thinking about what came next. Because this part, the public part, was only the beginning. The patrol car rolled through the neighborhood at a steady speed. Not fast, not slow, ordinary. That was what made it worse. Sunlight flashed across the windshield as they turned onto the main road. The inspector sat rigid in the back seat, hands cuffed behind him, shoulders pressed into the hard plastic. Every bump in the pavement sent a dull jolt through his wrists. He adjusted his breathing slow and controlled the same way he had taught witnesses to do when fear threatened to take over. He stared at the metal mesh divider inches from his face. The radio chatter floated through it, distorted voices, codes, half-sentences. None of them were about him, not yet. In the front seat, the officer drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting near the console. His eyes stayed forward. He didn't look in the mirror, not once. Silence filled the car, thick and intentional. The inspector broke it. "You need to call a supervisor," he said. "This arrest is unlawful." No response. "You are detaining a federal officer without probable cause. I am asking you to verify my credentials." The officer exhaled through his nose a sharp breath. "You'll get your chance," he said. The words landed heavy, not reassurance, control. They pulled into the station parking lot just before. Suing building looked the same as any other weekday. Morning officers coming and going, a civilian clerk carrying coffee, the American flag hanging limp in the still air. Normal life continuing while something deeply abnormal unfolded inside one vehicle. The back door opened. Cool air rushed in. The inspector stepped out carefully, feet finding the pavement back straight. A couple of officers glanced over, then looked away. A black man in cuffs didn't register as unusual, not here. He was guided through the doors, past a desk, down a short hallway. The smell changed. Coffee, paper, cleaning solution, a familiar institutional blend. The cuffs tightened again as the officer adjusted his grip, not violently but firmly enough to remind him who was in control. Inside the processing area, time seemed to slow. Keys clinked. A printer hummed. Someone laughed quietly at a joke he couldn't hear. The inspector was positioned beside a bench and told to wait. The officer stepped away to speak with another uniform, gesturing briefly toward him. He stood there, hands behind his back, heart steady now, eyes moving, cameras in the corners, names on doors, a clock ticking above the bulletin board. Every detail filed away. This was the injustice. Not just the cuffs, not just the ride, but the casual way it happened, the efficiency, the assumption that this was acceptable routine justified, that a man doing his job could be stripped of authority and dignity without anyone stopping to ask why. The officer returned with a form in his hand. "Name," he said. The inspector gave it. "Occupation?" "Postal Inspector, United States Postal Inspection Service." The officer paused, pen hovering for half a second, then wrote anyway. "We'll see about that." The inspector said nothing. He didn't argue. He didn't plead. He watched the pen move, knowing that every word written now would either condemn or expose the person writing it. Somewhere down the hall, a door opened. Footsteps approached. A different voice asked a quiet question. The officer answered just as quietly. The room felt tighter, the air heavier. This was the moment when systems either corrected themselves or doubled down, when a mistake was acknowledged or cemented into a report. And standing there, cuffed and silent, the inspector understood one thing with absolute clarity. What happened on the street had followed him inside, and whatever came next would decide far more than how this morning ended. The change didn't come with shouting. It came with silence. A man in a white shirt stepped into the processing area and stopped when he saw who was standing there. He didn't speak right. Away. He looked at the cuffs, then at the inspector's face, then back at the officer, holding the clipboard. "What's this?" he asked. "Suspicious mail theft," the officer said. Caller reported someone tampering with mailboxes. The man in the white shirt nodded once, slow, and his eyes stayed on the inspector. "Sir," he said, "what is your name and title?" The inspector answered clearly. United States Postal Inspector, badge number included. He recited it from memory the way he'd done in courtrooms, briefing rooms, and sworn testimony. The words landed differently here. The man turned and walked toward a desk phone without another word. He didn't ask the officer for clarification. He didn't ask for opinions. He dialed. The room waited. The officer shifted his weight. He crossed his arms, then uncrossed them. The confidence that had filled his voice on the street didn't follow him inside. It had no place to sit now. Pens, scratched paper somewhere behind them. The clock on the wall clicked forward 1 second at a time. Yes, the man on the phone said quietly. Postal Inspection Service, I need verification. The inspector watched the officer's reflection in the glass of a nearby office window. He saw the moment it began to register, the tightening around the eyes, the jaw working without sound. The call ended. The man in the white shirt turned back. Remove the cuffs, he said. The officer hesitated, just a fraction of a second. Then he reached forward and unlocked them. Metal opened. Pressure released. The inspector flexed his fingers slowly, blood-returning sensation blooming back into his hands. You're confirmed, the man said, now facing him fully. Active federal inspector assigned to this area today. The room felt different instantly. The air moved again. People looked up. Someone stopped typing. The officer swallowed. His face had gone pale, then flushed, then pale again. He opened his mouth, closed. He opened it once more. I didn't know, he said finally. He sounded smaller now, defensive. I was responding to a call. You arrested a federal officer performing official duties, the man replied. His voice stayed even, but the words carried weight. You did so without verifying credentials. The officer's eyes flicked toward the floor, then back up. I thought they might be fake. The inspector met his gaze for the first time since the cuffs came off. He didn't glare. He didn't smile. He just looked. That was enough. A supervisor entered the room, then another. Questions were asked, this time in the right direction. Timelines, reports, names. The clipboard changed hands. You're free to go, the supervisor said to the inspector. An apology followed. Then another. They stacked up quickly once they started. The inspector nodded. He didn't say much. He gathered his belongings. His gloves were gone. The clipboard had been bent. Small things, inconvenient things, evidence. As he walked toward the exit, he passed the officer. They didn't speak. The officer stared straight ahead, eyes unfocused like someone watching a wall collapse in slow motion. Outside, the sun was higher now. The morning had moved on, but something irreversible had already happened inside those walls. The truth had surfaced, and it had teeth. The paperwork moved faster than the patrol car ever had. By the end of the week, the inspector's name was no longer confined to an internal incident log. It appeared on a federal civil rights complaint filed with precision dates and timestamps aligned down to the minute. Unlawful detention. False arrest. Violation of Fourth Amendment protections. Each allegation supported by witness statements, dispatch records, and the video that had already begun circulating online. The footage spread quietly at first. A shaky clip from across the street. Another angle from a porch. Then a clearer recording surfaced, capturing the officer's voice, the cuffs, the open mailboxes left behind. Within 48 hours, the views passed 1 million comment sections filled with the same sentence written 100 different ways. He was doing his job. The department issued a short statement. An incident occurred. An investigation is underway. Policy will be reviewed. It satisfied no one. Internal Affairs pulled the officer off the street. His badge and weapon were logged. His body camera history was reviewed frame by frame. Patterns emerged that had been invisible when viewed one complaint at a time. Stops that escalated without. Caused assumptions filling gaps where reasonable suspicion should have been warnings noted, then forgotten. The lawsuit named more than one person. It named the officer. It named the department. It named the city. Because the argument was simple, this wasn't just about one bad decision. It was about a system that let those decisions stack up until someone with federal authority and documentation was the one in cuffs. Behind closed doors, city attorneys watched the videos without sound. They didn't need it. The body language was enough. They compared it to case law they already knew. They saw no path to trial that didn't end in disaster. Settlement talks began before the officer's appeal paperwork was finished. $6.2 million. That was the number that finally stopped moving, not because it erased what happened, but because it reflected the scope of it, the public arrest, the humiliation, the constitutional violation, the message sent to every person who watched the video and understood exactly why this happened. The officer was terminated before the ink dried. No press conference, just a notice posted internally. Conduct, unbecoming, failure to follow. Procedure, unlawful arrest. His union reviewed. The case and declined arbitration. The evidence was too clean. The line had been crossed too. Clearly, training memos followed. New protocols. Mandatory credential verification. Revised response language for suspicious person calls. All the things that appeared after damage had already been done. The inspector declined interviews. He didn't celebrate. He returned to work. Different routes. Same gloves. Same careful documentation. But when he opened mailboxes, now people watched differently. Some nodded. Some apologized without saying why. Justice, when it came, didn't arrive loudly. It arrived in consequences. Careers ended. Budgets adjusted. Policies rewritten. And one quiet morning on a suburban street became a case study in what happens when authority mistakes bias for instinct. What happened on that street was not a gray area. From a legal standpoint, it was simple. The Fourth Amendment requires reasonable suspicion before a detention and probable cause before an arrest. A vague call describing a black man near mailboxes did not meet that standard. The inspector's presence, his gloves, his methodical actions, and his offer to present credentials all cut against any claim of criminal behavior. The moment the officer chose not to verify and proceeded anyway, the violation was complete. The law is clear about this. Authority does not replace verification. An officer's belief is not evidence, and silence or calm explanation is not defiance. Courts have ruled again and again that refusing to abandon one's lawful activity does not justify detention. In this case, the arrest was not just unlawful, it was indefensible. But law alone does not explain why it happened. The deeper issue was bias, not always loud or openly hostile, but efficient and confident. The kind that fills in gaps without asking questions. Suspicious person becomes suspicious black person. Working becomes stealing. Calm becomes deceptive. Once that mental shortcut is taken, every fact that follows is filtered to support the first assumption. That is how ordinary moments turn into constitutional violations. For the public, there are lessons here that matter. If you are stopped, stay calm. Do not argue emotionally. State facts clearly. Ask for verification, not confrontation. If it is safe, document. If others are present, their recordings matter more than you think. Names, times, badge numbers, all of it becomes evidence later. For institutions, the lesson is harsher. Training that exists only on paper is useless. Complaints that accumulate without consequence are warnings, ignored. Systems that rely on discretion without accountability will eventually expose themselves, usually on video, usually at great cost. This case did not end because someone was lucky. It ended because the person arrested knew the law and had the resources to enforce it afterward. Most people do not. That is the part that should unsettle everyone. Justice arrived here, but it arrived late and only after damage was done. The real question is not whether the officer was fired or the city paid millions. The real question is how many similar stops never reach this point. How many end quietly without cameras, without lawsuits, without correction? Because those are the cases that define whether this story is an exception or a warning.